It seems like the past century has been least kind to Ukraine of all the countries in Europe. Fought over repeatedly in World War II by rampaging armies, which came off the back of revolution, civil war, terror, and the genocide of the Holodomor. Ukraine has been plagued with monumental events, wars, famines, political upheavals, but there's a recurring theme to this. It's the struggle to break away from Russia, which, like an abusive husband, refuses to let Ukraine go, while threatening to destroy everything in retribution. Putin is just the latest incarnation of leaders who've pursued monstrous policies of imperialism, domination, and genocidal action whenever they felt Ukraine slipping out of their control. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you enjoy the materials we create, please do like and subscribe so you can help people discover our fantastic guests. Andrew S. Weiss is James Family Chair and Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. There he leads an international team of experts on Russia, Ukraine, and the wider region. He has previously been a director at the RAND Center for Russia and Eurasia. Andrew's career has spanned both public and private sectors. He served as director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian affairs on the National Security Council staff, as a member of the State Department's policy planning staff, and as policy assistant in the Office for the Undersecretary of Defense during the administrations of President Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Jonathan. It's great to be here.
Well, we're going to discuss your book, but before we get into that, this is a question I ask almost everyone on the channel. Were you surprised at the outbreak of full-scale war in February of this year? And given your close study of Vladimir Putin as a political figure and as a personality, do you think this year has been out of character for him?
Good question. So, as you know, people in the think tank industry are graded on a curve, and there's very little accountability for what we say. It's also the case that people, we're dealing with imperfect information, and we try to be helpful in putting some broader context on things, or perhaps offering immediate analysis. I had something unusual happen to me, which was that I was the co-author of a paper that we wrote in October of 2021, my colleague Eugene Rumor and I, and the paper was entitled Ukraine, Putin's Unfinished Business, and it was publicly released in November after being passed around in samizdat form in various Western governments. And that paper really laid out the predicate for war and why Putin was going to go to war in Ukraine, what his strategic imperative was, what he saw as the opening that was created in the wake of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, Angela Merkel's departure as German chancellor, and then just the disarray that was in place at that time inside Ukraine. So that paper got a lot of attention at the time. I don't think that's ever happened in my career. Probably will never happen again. So I don't think I should write anything else because it was the first time that I had the ability to claim that I saw it coming. But at the same time, just to be really brutally honest, the actual face of the war and what we all witnessed in the early days was so horrifying and just, and still is completely dismaying and horrifying that I don't think anyone can say, oh, I wasn't surprised. I think the savagery, the criminality, and the incompetence that the Russians have displayed is still, are all still really shocking, and you can't get used to it. On the second part of your question about sort of was any of this, if I am correct in remembering your question about sort of is this out of character for Putin? A war like this that's unprovoked, that's just sheer naked aggression, this is different. This is a level of overreach and miscalculation that we haven't seen Putin engage in before. But it built on a foundation of, provocative moves, and depends on when you want to start the clock. Some people start the clock in 2008 with the invasion of Georgia. Some people start the clock a little later. The war obviously really started in 2014. None of this had to happen. I mean, all of this is not just a natural dispute between Russia and Ukraine or the natural byproduct of Ukraine's quest for independence. This is, I think, largely a product of the the both the level of opportunism that I mentioned before, as well as a series of sort of miscalculations and grievances that Putin collected over the course of his 20 years in power. And then also just a feeling of being a grand man of history whose audacity had made Russia great again. And anyways, I'm happy to drill down on any of that if that's helpful.
No, that's fantastic. And all these insights here, and of course, some people start the clock even earlier with Grozny, which, of course, at that point, the West was happy to turn a blind eye to. Those wars which he sort of inherited from Yeltsin. But let's join the conversation up with the book. You've seen from a political point of view how this has played out and Putin's evolution, but you've written an extraordinary book. I mean, as far as I can tell, is it the first graphic novel of this particular kind relating to Putin and Russia?
There's another one by a British author named Daryl Cunningham that came out about maybe a year and a half ago. I haven't read it, but I think Daryl Cunningham is a really well-regarded British cartoonist, so people should have a look.
Well, could you give me the background for the book? Because I'm intrigued about how it came about, how you've gone from your career in Washington to this extraordinary creation. And we'll put a link, obviously, in the video so people can check it out and get themselves a copy. But what was the genesis of the project? And then, of course, we're going to go into, I guess, the challenges and difficulties of planning it out, collaborating, writing, and all those details.
Yeah, no, sure thing. So the two sort of key driving forces in my quirky career move here of doing a graphic novel, which wasn't the customary thing for a person working at a think tank or ex-government official, obviously. One is the genre is great. I really think this is it's a pretty special genre when it works, and some of the most powerful books in graphic novel form have tackled very hard subjects. There's a book which I haven't read about by the former cast member of Star Wars about what it was like to be in an internment camp as a Japanese American during World War II. There are great books about the Holocaust, about the civil rights movement in the US, about the Iranian Revolution, about Nazi Germany. So I mean, like this is a powerful intellectual format that people should appreciate. And I was really thinking there was a story here that would work well in the format. But then also I was really aware that people in the think tank universe or the Russia policy universe tend to be a somewhat insular bunch, and that a lot of our work is aimed at each other. Sometimes we get invited to provide comments to the media, which is a nice thing, but it's often about something that's right now. What's your immediate reaction to this thing that just happened? And it's hard to step back and provide a bigger context and explain, as I tried to do in this book, why is Putin acting this way? What is it about the course of his career that led us to this point? And then also, what is it about Russia's 1,000-year history that has led us to this point? And to situate the things that everyone's talking about, the war in Ukraine, things like that, in that bigger scope. And the graphic novel was just a great way to do that, because you can jump in and out of the timeline. You don't have to, the joy of comics is that, time is a relative device. And the thing that draws your attention are just the panels right in front of you, as opposed to, a 1,000-page essay. And some people may have, frankly, there are good books that are 1,000 pages long about Russia. There are plenty of them, but not everybody has the time to dig in and really, spend that kind of, concerted attention on a book at that length.
I think it's a really interesting point, because, I spend quite a lot of time arguing with, I guess they're a fringe, but arguing with people about what the causes of the war were, and of course on a certain sort of Sometimes on the sort of far left, far right, you get the argument, well, this is fundamentally NATO's fault, etc. That whether you're speaking to people who are, aligned with your point of view or not, you tend to revert to abstractions to talk about events on this kind of scale. I think the unique quality of your book is that it's that biographical element. It blends the history and the big picture events with the story of a single man. And I think it brings back the idea that none of this was actually inevitable. None of this had to happen. And that the personal qualities of one flawed individual have perhaps amplified or even diverted historical trends.
Well, thanks for saying all that. I can't top what you just said, but Putin was an accidental president and was picked in a pretty arbitrary fashion by the inner circle around Boris Yeltsin as his time in office was petering out. And the main thing people saw in him was that he was loyal, that he was a hard worker, and that he wasn't likely to be off the leash, and that that the inner circle around Yeltsin would basically be able to keep him from acting too independently. And they had an unwritten understanding that he would protect that group of people from prosecution, that he would basically keep the system in place that he had inherited. And Putin didn't have the attributes that he now is widely believed to have, this kind of big personality, the machismo, and this kind of man of action image, and all that stuff was conjured up basically whole cloth by the Kremlin's messaging apparatus and PR teams to give the Russian people both the reassurance that the country was being passed into good hands, even if no one had ever heard of Vladimir Putin before, as well as to kind of create this cartoonish quality of their leader to make him seem like a person worthy of being a grand figure. And all the cartoonish elements that were really sort of an attempt to kind of take the worst of Hollywood in the 80s, the kind of action hero stuff. They had literally in the earliest days when Putin was still president candidate in waiting during the handover period, sort of at the end of 1999 through his formal election in early 2000, they had him do things like fly in a jet fighter or wear a sailor suit. And it was a put on. And Putin, there's some funny parts in the book where people who were involved in helping orchestrate that explain how it wasn't even very comfortable for Putin to have to do this stuff, because it was play acting and it wasn't what he was naturally comfortable doing. And then there's a great line in the book from one of his former political advisors where eventually that play acting became the guy, and that sort of took over, the persona became the person as opposed to vice versa. Or I'm sorry, the persona became the person. So, it was a life imitating art reality. But I do think we in the West, the number of times you see references to Putin carrying guns, being bare-chested, talking to animals, whatever it is, like that has become the iconography by which we define who he is, as opposed to the fact that he was a middling intelligence officer at best, whose KGB career stalled out, as opposed to a person whose career was held up because he was a hothead, as opposed to the fact that, he's just not at a world, he's not the world-class figure per se that, his handlers try to portray him as.
It's a bit Wizard of Oz, isn't it? It's the guy behind the curtain.
Yeah, but at the same time, he's been incredibly successful. So I don't want to denigrate to the point where people think there's no there. Clearly, there is a there, and he has had a remarkable run as Russia's leader, and we still don't know how to deal with that. So I don't want to for a minute suggest that if we just strip away the artifice here, that Putin will be like the Wizard of Oz, as you say, and there's just a kind of an empty seat. Like, no, there's a person there who has authority and control of the Russian state in a lot of ways, but we should never overstate it or misperceive where the myth and the reality are not totally overlapping.
So there is an apparatus, obviously, that supports him in the speeches he gives. But at the same time, at events, I guess, like WWII, which is cancelled this year, I'm going to ask in a minute about your impressions of him really withdrawing back from many of the media initiatives that he's done in almost every year of his presidency. He'll sometimes be in front of the world, well, not the world's press, a carefully selected group of journalists and some of the public, and mostly creative questions, but he does get the off kind of curveball. But he'll do that for hours and hours, won't he? And he'll be thinking on his feet. So he is quite eloquent. He's not necessarily an intellectual. In fact, he's not an intellectual at all, but he is very eloquent, and he speaks good grammatical Russian, and he speaks it with confidence. So there are some skills there, aren't there? Some oratory skills.
Those weren't apparent at the beginning.
Mm.
But he's been doing this for 20 years, and anyone who's had the same job for 20 years gets to be okay at it. When he goes to a press conference, he seems to know his brief and he's well prepared. That's always been part of what propelled his career, was this notion that he worked hard and did his homework. But I don't feel the same way about a lot of these appearances myself. I think of them as purely about conveying an image and the level of theatricality. So the fact that he does a year-end press conference in which Russian reporters fall over themselves and carry stuffed animals to get his attention, there's a word in Russian, poshlost, which basically just means, utter tawdriness. There's a lot of that, which I personally have no time for. And then as someone who, punishes himself by reading transcripts or watching these broadcasts, the amount you get out of it is inverse proportional and, in inverse proportion to the time expended. There's not a lot of, valuable insight. And because there's so much play acting and messaging going on, I would always be wary about saying this reveals what Putin actually thinks. This is someone who's really good at never telling you what he actually thinks, unless it's really important. And on the Ukraine crisis, he did start to share a view of Ukraine towards the months leading up to the war, that he meant business, and that he was, no kidding, serious about conquering Ukraine again. But in the book, what I've also, I think, tried to do for people is to say that all of this, the trappings of grandeur, of being the heir to the czars, being the heir to the Soviet general secretaries, like all of that is intended to make Putin seem more in charge of things than he actually is. And you see this constant effort in Russia, and we see this most horribly in the conduct of the war, to act like, Putin points his finger and something is supposed to happen, but then it doesn't. And, Putin spent billions of dollars modernizing the Russian military and created what he, portrayed to the world, and all of us largely thought was a formidable, serious modern military. It was smaller than the Soviet military, but still modern. And now we've seen in the course of the war in Ukraine that it was, not nearly as, capable as it was advertised as being. There's a lot of that in the nature of how Russia is ruled today. And it sort of comes back to the fact that the country is corrupt, that people play act at stuff and create Potemkin capability as opposed to actual capability. And then just the fact that, people will get away with it, that, there's no, at least so far, very few indications that anyone's been punished for the ineptitude that this war has been conducted with. There's no indication that the cost of the war will, change the policy in a Western society. I think something is big a debacle as this, there are consequences. We have elections, we have parliamentary inquiries. Like Russia doesn't have any. We have a free press. Russia has none of that stuff.
And that's an interesting point. I think it's one which a lot of the press sort of skirts over. We ascribe a lot of Russia's failures to corruption, poor quality of say, production of armaments and whatever, and disorganization and lack of strategy. But I think there's something more pernicious going on, and that maybe helps to explain why individuals haven't actually been punished. And that is nepotism. I think the entire system that he's built, that vertical, that power vertical, in a way is much more feudal than I think many appreciate, and it's built from top to bottom on the idea that you can get a position not through competence but through relationships. And that makes it much more difficult to fire people if you've built this kind of edifice based on nepotism. But it also tells you something of how the whole country works. How does that relate back to Putin's biography itself? Because nepotism, to an extent, is what got him parachuted into this job, or Yeltsin putting him in there as a placeman to protect his not his legacy, but his family's wealth and ill-gotten gains.
There's a page in the book that tries to explain very much in shorthand how feudalistic the political system is and why the lack of institutions, the lack of trust, the lack of rule of law, and the lack of formal administrative mechanisms pushes things toward the kind of system you're describing, where everything's only as good as the fact that it's your brother, like a blood relative or someone you've known for 40 years working with you, that you couldn't possibly rely on a person you've never met to abide by their professional obligations to you or fulfill or provide a service that you've contracted for. And you've seen this in Russia, throughout the post-Soviet period in particular. I mean, it was also the case that a lot of things had to be done informally in the Soviet system because a centrally directed system was always so inefficient. And the ways Soviet citizens would access services or products or run a business like a state enterprise had to depend on networks of connections. So that informal system is not new. But what you see under Putin is that and I think this is the big change, which is also, something that I focus on in the book, in the run up to the war in Ukraine, a lot of the people who he had put in place during the first 20 years of his time in office, a lot of those people had aged out by the time COVID hit, by the time he went into this remarkable self-isolation. And he was surrounded, for the most part, by people who are much younger than he is, who just follow orders, or who sit there and whose influence is a byproduct of the proximity to the boss. And most of those people are not going to get ahead in the system by being challenging to him. They're going to get there by saying yes. They're going to get ahead by saying, yes, sir, or, can I get you another cup of coffee? And it's remarkable when you look at how, even now that the government needs to provide for its military operation, it needs to have, proper procedures in place to keep the economy going. There's, it's still the same system. It's not, it's no accident that, when the call up occurred of new, draftees and the autumn, that a lot of these people showed up and couldn't get basic, equipment, and had to crowdsource or self-fund things like sleeping bags and warm underwear and stuff like that. Like, it's, it really gets at the fact that the system, for all of its pyramidical, hierarchical nature, doesn't deliver very much on the, sort of from the top down. And people, survive in a system like that by their wits and by their horizontal connections, a lot of which are just, one or two circles out from their immediate family and associates.
So we've got this sort of Potemkin village structure, which to many Western experts appeared far more competent and militarily capable than it actually turned out to be. But let's sort of rewind that down to Putin, because in amongst all of this, I'm going to call it fake, but in amongst all of this sort of built up, almost duplicitous kind of facade, I'd like to go back to what is genuine about Putin. What has genuinely influenced him through his life and had an impact on him, real values. I'm thinking here things like judo, things like 17 Days of Spring, which is something you mentioned in the book, 17 Mgновения весны. And so what are the genuine, unadulterated influences within his early life?
Yeah, the fun part of the book was sort of trying to look at Putin's childhood and upbringing and then related to how his career played out. And Putin grew up in a working class family in Leningrad after the war. His family had suffered significantly during the war. He had an older brother who was taken away from the family and died in an orphanage of diphtheria and buried in a mass grave. But Putin, his parents were working class. He got into a lot of trouble as a kid. There's a great memoir which people might want to look up by one of his childhood German teachers, and she describes this incident where when Putin was about 14 years old, he broke a kid's leg on purpose. And when the teacher asked him, why did you do this? Putin says, there are just some people who only understand force. This book was published a long time ago, not very well known as a source out there about Putin, but it sort of captures the fact that this was a guy in his teens who got in a lot of trouble. And, but at the same time, he loved Soviet pop culture about the KGB. And you can find in various sources the, ways that, he digested film and pulp fiction about the KGB, which was prevalent in the 1960s and early 70s, including the miniseries that you mentioned, 17 Moments of Spring. And what was funny is, on the one hand, it motivated him to want to join the KGB. So that's, part of why he knocked on the front door of the big KGB building in Leningrad when he was in ninth grade. It was a big part of why he stopped being such a street thug and really dedicated himself to his studies, both judo and the study of German language. So he eventually, like through dint of hard work, got himself into a good law school, in now St. Petersburg, then Leningrad. Like that was a non customary moment of social advancement in the Soviet system, which was not any sure thing. But what's funny is that after getting into the KGB, his career went nowhere. And he spent about 10 years from 1975 to 1985, as best we know, in real second tier, third tier roles. And the book opens, the opening scene, where Putin manages, after waiting 10 years, to get himself into an overseas training program, and he totally screws it up by dint of having a short temper or getting into a fight on the Leningrad subway system. So, so there's a lot there that, people, I think, lose sight of when they think of this KGB agent. People tend to glamorize that and project onto him a level of career success that never really happened.
And I've even seen some attempts, I think propagandist attempts, to say, oh no, there is some extraordinary, he was actually much more senior than this biographical details suggest. And it's all very hush hush. I mean, I think he must have some kind of a chip on his shoulder, because it sounds incredibly dull. And Dresden was a real backwater, wasn't it? Where he was eventually sent and where he observed the collapse of the Soviet Union. He wasn't at the front of the action. He was really, stuck behind the lines, twiddling his thumbs. And even his seniors, I think, one of the quotes you've got in the book says that, all the period of 10 years he was actually in service, his particular department probably produced, no work of any real note or impact. And that's quite damning, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt there's a lot of score settling in a lot of these accounts, and the veracity of all these things is not 100% well established. Like, we don't have access to all the facts, but there's nothing I've seen out there that suggests that Vladimir Putin was a high flyer or deep selected for greatness or a paragon of all the things that senior people in the KGB were supposed to be doing. But what's interesting, and I think this is sort of an underappreciated part of understanding Putin that we need to really focus on and understanding what happened in Ukraine, is that in 1989, he's in this small KGB outpost. There's 6 officers in Dresden compared to the 1,000 plus who were serving in Berlin. So just give you a sense of how tiny the outpost was. And in Dresden, there was people power on the streets, and it had an important role to play in the unraveling of the DDR, the East German system. And in these fateful weeks in October, when Putin was in Dresden, there was this crazy thing that happened where East Germans had fled the country, and there was an elaborate deal that was worked out between the East German government and the West German government to give these people access to exit visas to leave the country and move to West Germany. And Putin was in Dresden when people, it was a complicated deal that the governments worked out, but basically the people who had tried to leave East Germany had to be formally expelled, and they were put on sealed trains heading out of East Germany. And the trains stopped in Dresden. And people who also wanted to leave stormed the train station thinking this is their last chance to get out of the country. And there were street violence around the Dresden train station as people attacked the Interior Ministry troops and the Stasi. There was also a storming of the main Stasi prison, which was down the street from where Putin's KGB offices were in Dresden a little later on. And the point is that all of this, sort of rapid unraveling of the East German police state, I think sent Putin into a sort of a swivet in terms of fearing what happens when governments loosen their grip and what happens when people, like everyday people, stop being afraid of an authoritarian state. And that's been a theme throughout his time in office, that people power, what he calls color revolutions, are one of the single biggest threats to his rule. And to keep things under wraps, he needs to be as tough as possible. And that's been, I think part of why he's overreacted and miscalculated so badly in Ukraine, because he really saw what was happening in Ukraine, where there have been several instances of street revolution or people power as, basically dress rehearsals for something similar happening in Russia itself.
And that maybe is something that he has brought to the Kremlin, and that is that over-exaggerated sense of paranoia. But apart from paranoia, what would you say his chief characteristics are? I mean, we also see potentially a lack of empathy. I mean, the previous person I was speaking to talks about the sort of horrific crimes and the towering indifference which Putin seems to have to individual life, or to life of anyone outside of his close circle. But apart from those two characteristics, what other characteristics do you think he brought with him from not just the KGB days, but also, we'll talk about in a minute, his days as a sort of mafia go-between in Sobchak's administration in St. Petersburg, which was a hotbed of criminality?
Well, on most levels, I think Putin is quite nimble and cunning and calculating. And so this is a person on some level who for 20 years has been doing this, who knows the backstory on things, who's completely unsentimental, and who is opportunistic. And we've seen that pay off quite well for him, whether it was in the what was perceived at the time to be the masterstroke of seizing Crimea in February of 2014, or saving the Assad regime in 2015. There's another side of him which is also pretty emotional and hot-headed, and we've seen that come out from the earliest days of his presidency, and it was something I witnessed when I was at the White House more than 20 years ago. And seeing Putin lose his cool, or have a, you say paranoid, but just have a kind of fixation on the idea that the United States is seeking regime change and that they want to get Putin out of power, that, the only way to deal with those kinds of threats is to be, an authoritarian, but also to really keep your adversaries off balance. And that's been, I think, a big part of what motivates and drives Putin's behavior, for the past 20 years. As far as the experience, we can, maybe I'll pause there and then we can talk a little bit about the Leningrad, St. Petersburg period, in the fixer kind of world, the kind of, informal economy where Putin was clearly involved. I'm happy to pause there, but I just will say that so much of Russia is informal and corrupt. it's a little bit challenging to say that's where he cut his teeth, or that's where, it all started to get pretty shady. I think it's been pretty shady for a long time. And I wouldn't say
Yes.
that was the cradle of shadiness there.
In some respects, it's interesting, isn't it, to compare Russia to Ukraine? And I know there are actually very different countries, and I've learned more and more as I've done these podcasts about the key differences. But in some respects, the system he brought to governing Russia built on what was there before, but he also entrenched it, didn't he? The fact that there has been no transition of power, the fact that he has degraded institutions and anyone who could challenge him, meant that that system of governance, which was prevalent in the 90s, has remained. Whereas in Ukraine, with its chaos and its proto-democratic sort of chaos and transitions and revolutions, they have been able to evolve away from, to an extent, that purely nepotistic and as you say, sort of informal economic sort of structure. Is it the absence of strong leadership that's actually allowed, I would say, some form of rules-based system to emerge and move it away from that sort of Soviet economy? Because they came from the same place. And in fact, in the 90s, Ukraine was thought to be more institutionally corrupt than Russia.
So let me just pull back the tape just a little bit and say that after the Soviet Union collapsed and Putin is marooned back in then Leningrad, gets a job working in the city government, and is a helper to this mayor who's corrupt and who's got a kind of very posh public image, but doesn't deliver on any of the promises of making it a showcase city. There's no doubt that the collapse of the Soviet system created these huge vacuums, and the vacuums were filled by criminal groups, by corrupt officials, by members of the security establishment, and that they all sort of fused into a new commingling of interests where criminality and corruption and abuse of office was the system, and that has, that reached its apogee in any of the post-Soviet cities in what became St. Petersburg. And it was a uniquely violent, dangerous place, and it was known as Bandit Petersburg. And so when people make TV shows about the bad 90s, like they show where things were in Petersburg at the time, it was a rough and bad place. At the same time, there was the side of Putin and his crowd that were, and I think this is cardinal to who they are, and it's depicted in the book, государственники, which means supporters of a strong state as an end in itself, and that the interests of the state should trump everything else. And yes, there's a level of cynicism in political life in Russia, and surely the fat cats got a lot fatter during Putin's time, and people who knew Putin personally were given control over major state and commercial interests, and profited handsomely from taking over, for example, the state oil company Rosneft, or the gas monopoly Gazprom. So there's no doubt that the state's interest didn't always trump personal interest when it came to that kind of self-dealing and enrichment. But I would caution you about the comparisons between Russia and Ukraine a little bit, and I would focus on the period maybe before 2014, before the Revolution of Dignity, and the kind of Ukraine that existed from 1991 to then. I'm not a licensed, credentialed expert on Ukraine, but I will say that we saw a very cronyistic, oligarchic system in Ukraine where there was state capture, and where it was more competitive in the sense that oligarchs competed with each other and had access to media, but they hollowed out the state pretty exhaustively to benefit themselves. And as a result, average Ukrainians, fell far behind average Russians in terms of their quality of life and in their, socioeconomic well-being. Some of that has to do with the fact that Russia just had more natural resources and had more of a, sort of well-run economy, relatively speaking, for that region during the post-Soviet, post-2000 period, under Putin. And that the level of economic governance in Russia post 2000 was better on measure in Russia than it was in Ukraine. But now, since the war started, I think you do see something that just Russia cannot match. And you saw it after 2014 as well, which is the strength of Ukraine's civil society. And you have an ability for average citizens to take responsibility for things and to organize themselves and to do heroic things. And that was manifest in the street revolutions in 2004 and then again in 2014. And now most vividly in the defense of their country after the Russian invasion. Russians just have never matched in the Putin era that level of self-organization and responsibility that Ukrainian civil society activists have. At the same time, the Russian government has declared war on civil society. And that's, so it's not just that Russians are genetically somehow unable to do this. There's cultural reasons for it, and sociological reasons for why people behave this way. But we just need to remember that the Putin government deliberately tried to squeeze out of that country any semblance of independent activity or non-state mandated activity and put a pretty high price on people who chose to ignore those guidelines.
And is there anything in Putin's biography prior to St. Petersburg that could explain, this need to absolutely sort of control? Well, firstly, to stay in power, almost endlessly. He's clearly in the role until he expires, I would have thought. Otherwise, he might have left on a high in 2014. So what explains that need to cling on to power, but also the need to control and stifle any voices of dissent?
Well, in 2003, you had the first of the street revolutions in the post-Soviet space. There were a series of these: 2003, 2004, 2008, 2014. And it really made the Russian leadership really nervous. And they persuaded themselves, looking at things like the Arab Spring, that there was this U.S., hand behind the, people's actions, that, the CIA, NGOs, tech firms. Like, if you read what the Russian officials portray even the October Revolution as, that this is all part of some bigger pattern of conspiracy and Western effort to, cripple governments that it doesn't like and, usher them off the stage and seek geopolitical advantage under the flag of democracy promotion. So this is what they believe. And if we don't see that as a key motivating force, I think then we don't fully understand why Putin, for example, in the current crisis, may do really desperate things, because he doesn't think this is just about control over some disputed territories of Ukraine that he wants to take over. This is about this very survival of his regime in the end. And he now believes that, this is a war for his own continued staying power as Russia's leader. That's didn't have to be that way, but he's put himself in that corner. I don't think these are, at this point, given the criminality, given all the blood that's been spilled, it's going to be very hard for Western governments to re-engage with Putin. So even if, in some hard to foresee set of circumstances, there's a peace process and there is a deal that somehow magically would emerge, I can't see the conditions for that materializing anytime soon. It's just really hard to imagine how any Western government could ever go back to some form of normal interactions with the Putin government in the future. Like, it's become a pariah, and it's going to stay on the outsides of the mainstream international system so long as Putin is there. There's no way back at this point.
That's it. And he saw weakness in the West after Syria. He's seen what he thinks is weakness and degeneracy. And yet the West has united and pushed back, perhaps in a way that he wasn't expecting. Do you think our response has taken him by surprise?
Yeah, quite definitely. And I think, frankly, a lot of Western governments were surprised that Russia tried and failed. The betting was, if you haven't read the New York Times investigation, but the betting was Russia would very quickly walk all over the Ukrainians, just as it had done in 2014 and 2015. And people vastly overestimated, myself included, how much how successful the Russian military campaign would be. We all thought it was not going to be a fair fight. And to their great credit, the Ukrainians, staved off disaster and have now punched back really hard. I don't see on the horizon a way for the Russian government to prevail militarily, but I do see their ability to, devastate Ukraine and to sort of create a shell Ukraine where there's no, basic provision of services, and the government has to sort of stay on life support thanks to Western economic assistance and technical assistance. By the same token, I see no indication that the West is going to give up the kind of military and other security support we're providing the Ukrainians. And I don't think the Ukrainians will at any point sort of be cowed or lay down their arms. So there's a formula or a set of processes that have been put in place here that to me adds up to an open-ended conflict and a war that goes on for a very long time. We all watch it and we all kind of want it to end because it's so horrible, but any ceasefire or something like that is only going to benefit the Russian side because it'll give them a chance to regroup and rebuild, and that would be bad. But at the same time, the idea that the Ukrainians are not feeling deep existential worry that the Russians are out to exterminate them, and that the only way to deal with that threat is to fight. It seems self-evident to me that they're going to fight. And they're not the Western tool. Like if the President of the United States or British Prime Minister calls up Ukrainian counterpart and says, "Hey, now's the time to stop fighting," I'm not really sure that kind of recommendation gets much of a hearing. The people of Ukraine feel they're dealing with a quasi-genocidal onslaught, and the only way to deal with that threat is to fight.
Well, for my last question, I mean, I broadly absolutely agree with that, and I think they should fight, because I think it's now become absolutely clear what happens to people who give in to the Russian army. I mean, it's horrific, and the intelligentsia, the political classes get wiped out in much the way that happened in the 1930s and Stalin's deportations. For my last question, I want to really turn back to the book, because I've got two questions really. One is, how was it working with an artist to create that final product, to blend the words and the story with the artistry? That must have been, quite challenging and a new experience. And the other one is really, have you got any feedback on how the book is going down with your target audience, perhaps with, a younger demographic who perhaps don't read political articles in The Economist or the New York Times?
So I was really lucky. When I was first talking to the editor at Macmillan First Second, Mark Siegel, who worked with me on the book, he was giving me examples of different approaches and different recent graphic novels, and the ones he gave me by Brian Box Brown were just magical because of Brian's style. And then, a few weeks later, Mark called me up and said, "Brian wants to do your book," which was something Brian had never done before. He'd never drawn someone else's book. He'd always written his own and illustrated his own book. So I was just kind of in heaven when I heard that Brian wanted to do this. And part of what was so fun about it was that Brian's just like, he didn't come to the project with a view that like we need a set of touchstone images. Like he wanted to come up with something entirely new. And so when people open up the book, what you'll see is each chapter has this minimalist art style, and Brian has made the first chapter red and black, and the second chapter is blue and black, and the third chapter is yellow and black. Like there are these kind of very severe but really interesting aesthetic choices that Brian made. And then the last part, which was really fun about working with Brian, was I was determined to not repeat any visual cliches, to really minimize the amount of dancing bears and Matryoshka dolls and things like that, and hammers and sickles, and all this, the iconography that dominates a lot of the way Russia is portrayed in our pop culture. And I would just spend endless hours on Google image search trying to find Soviet or Russian images that were not part of the standard discourse. And Brian was really psyched about that because he comes to things with a indie sensibility. Like he's not really interested in trafficking and all the mainstream stuff. But the thing that's fun about him is he's really into pop culture, and because so much of Putin's rise to power was animated by Soviet pop culture, we were able to weave some of that into it. And the last thing I'll say, which shows my own ignorance, was that Brian was also at times gaming the audience and, potentially even gaming me, because there are Easter eggs, hidden in the book. And I didn't even know what an Easter egg was when I started writing the book. So it's just very fun to kind of collaborate with somebody like that who's got a totally different background. And then the hope is that, people, are going to respond to that and see that, Brian and I are very different, and we brought really different strengths to this project.
That's fantastic. And I don't know if you had much connection with people who've bought the book, or with, teenagers, people in their 20s, 30s, whatever. But have you had much interaction after people have had a chance to read it?
Well, I mean, it's probably self-selecting, because these are all people maybe, who are inclined to say nice things. But I keep getting streams of photos of readers. And so some of those readers are people in their 80s, photos of kids in their, like 10 or 11, as young as 10 or 11, who are reading it, college age people. So, I mean, it's really, it's remarkable to me how the book seems resonant across all these different demographics and backgrounds. And it's well exceeded any expectation I had that I was going to reach people that diverse.
I mean, it's a fantastic book. I've got to recommend to everyone watching this to get themselves a copy, especially with Christmas coming up. It's not necessarily the jolliest of reads, but it really brings history to life in an extremely visual way, and I think provides insights into the life of an extremely important individual in the world, which you don't tend to get from the mainstream media. I'm incredibly grateful for you speaking to me today, Andrew, and thanks so much for explaining this extraordinary project you've been involved in.
Oh, Jonathan, you're very kind to say all that. Thank you so much. Have a great holiday.
You too. Thank you.